Thank you very much, Alistair, and it's great to be back after 40 years, I think. A few things have changed around here, including the value of the property, I presume. It's a rather nice area. So I'm going to be talking about global nuclear governance and the role of the International Atomic Energy Agency. In case you're wondering about that logo, which seems very retro, it was one of the first designs for the agency's logo in the 1950s. And as you can see, it's got everything under the sun there. And that's pretty much a theme of the agency. They do an awful lot, and I'll be explaining the various mandates as we go along. So here's an overview of my presentation. I'll talk a bit about what global governance is, in case you're not familiar with that, the agency's place within the regime, its history, mandates and organisation, and its performance. And I'm not going to go through all of the agency's mandates, but I'll specifically focus on safeguards, security and safety. There are a whole lot more, but we'd be here all night if I went through all of them. And then I'll talk about a bit about the future of the agency. So what is global governance? Well, really it's all the bits and pieces that go together to create a system to internationally govern the use of nuclear energy, either peaceful uses or military. And academics, we talk about norms, so these norms are included, any rules, any treaties, organisations, all those bits and pieces which in theory form a system, but as you'll probably gather as I go along, it's not a particularly coherent one. And there are at least 5 sub-regimes to this, which is also problematic. And one thing you find is that people who know about nuclear safety tend not to know about nuclear security, they don't know much about safeguards, so it's a very siloed system, and that's one of the difficulties in anyone studying it. You really have to be across an awful lot of aspects of this governance regime. So what are some of the characteristics of this regime? It's very complex, as I think you'll begin to see. Just the number of acronyms is daunting enough. There's a constant tension between states' desire to retain their own sovereignty and the desire for governance, so regulating and governing properly the use of nuclear energy. And it's something that really can't be done only nationally, it has to be done internationally, but states are always reluctant to give up their sovereignty. So in the whole history of nuclear governance, you see this tension, probably as much or if not more than anywhere else, because nuclear is regarded as such a vital aspect of states' sovereignty. The way the system's evolved has been very organic, so it's rather disorganised. I always tell my students, well, no one sat down and designed the system, it just grew haphazardly, often to crises. And I'll talk a bit about the crises the agency's faced later on, but the whole governance system has had bits and pieces put onto it, and often they don't gel very well. So the safety people suggest things, for instance, that make security even worse. So they suggest, security people suggest locks on doors, for instance, to stop people getting access to nuclear material, but the safeguards inspectors need to get access to that material. They're not supposed to be confronting locks. So those sorts of things happen quite a deal in this rather amorphous regime. The most powerful states, as you can probably guess, have the biggest impact on it. But this is a bit different, this field, than others. It's not necessarily a north-south division, so it's not just developed countries running the place and developing countries don't have a say. And this is largely because uranium was a global mineral, and so states which had a lot of uranium, and when the agency was set up they were trying to take that into consideration, they had a big say in the way the governance structures were set up. So you had South Africa, for instance, being heavily involved. You had India, which was regarded as an up-and-coming nuclear power. So the way the system operates isn't quite what you might expect. It's not necessarily the rich states versus the poor. As I said, these regimes, these sub-regimes tend to operate in silos, so that's also problematic, and funnily enough, that's exactly the way the IAEA operates. So its Department for Safety often doesn't know exactly what's happening in the safeguards area, and that is a problem in global governance generally. And then finally, there's remarkably little industry involvement in this whole global governance enterprise, and that's really because industry is suspicious of governments, it's suspicious of international organisations. It just wants to get on and make money, basically. It's run its commercial operations as freely as it can. And anything to do with regulation, obviously at a national level or international level, is problematic for industry. So they tend to stay back from the agency and only engage when they absolutely need to. Many companies you speak to in the uranium business, for instance, say, well, non-proliferation is not their concern, that's a concern of governments. So you strike that all the time. So, I think that's readable. It seems rather faint, but so this is just to situate the IAEA and the global governance regime. And as you see, it has to deal with a lot of customers, as it were. You've got states, member states, you've got other international organisations. One of the strongest is Euratom, which runs safeguards in Europe. You have treaties, like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and other treaties which, in a sense, have foisted things onto the agency that it doesn't necessarily want to have to deal with. You have scientists and non-governmental organisations, academics, people like me, needling the agency. You have the nuclear industry, and within governments you have regulators as well. So regulators obviously have to run their own governance systems nationally, and they have to interact with the IAEA as well. And often they're saying, well, actually, we know what we're doing. We don't really need the IAEA to be telling us what to do. We're the regulator, we know. And at the top of the tree you have the UN Security Council. And the Security Council several times mandated the agency to do things which it wasn't necessarily willing to do. So for instance, the whole Iraq inspection regime was given to the agency, but very much under UN Security Council direction. And the agency really felt this. The agency treats itself as an independent organisation. It doesn't really like being told what to do. But the UN Security Council is certainly within its rights to tell the agency what to do. So the origins, the IAEA came about as a result of President Eisenhower's speech to the UN General Assembly. It's the famous Atoms for Peace speech. That was in 1953. And the idea was that we would promise everyone the benefits of nuclear energy. It was said at the time that you could produce electricity too cheap to meter. You wouldn't even bother selling it. That nuclear energy would produce very cheap electricity. And in return, you had to accept that you couldn't use nuclear material for military purposes. So that was the deal. And the IAEA was even expected to actually physically have nuclear material at its disposal. So the original idea was that the Americans and the Soviet Union would give the agency fissile material, and the agency would store it in a bank, physically somewhere, and then it would parcel it out to member states under safeguards. This was a brand new concept, safeguards, to stop them using it for military purposes. This didn't really happen. The agency really didn't ever assume this role of an honest broker in terms of physically possessing nuclear material and passing it on. But it evolved and acquired other sorts of mandates apart from that. And funnily enough, it actually does have a nuclear fuel bank right now. But that's really just for emergency cases. It's not meant to be a day-to-day provision of nuclear material by the agency. So it's funny to look back and think this tiny little agency in Vienna was originally in the Grand Hotel, so that's the original entrance of the agency in Vienna. So to somehow think that it would be managing all this nuclear material going back and forwards all over the globe, it was simply incredible. So that faded away very quickly. Within a year or so, the agency realised it wouldn't be able to do that. I always laugh because the inspectors were on the top floor. The initial IAEA inspectors were on the top floor of that building, and they were so unpopular because many thought, well, our business is to promote nuclear energy, not to restrict it. So they stuck the inspectors on the top floor where there was no lift. So they all had to walk up the extra floor. Things have changed. So here's the purpose of the IAEA. It's essentially to accelerate the use of nuclear technology and energy. But as you see, there's the caveat that as long as this isn't used for furthering any military purpose. And this is Article 2 of the IAEA Statute of 57. Don't expect you to read all this, but this is a very eventful history for an international organisation. As you can see, it's confronted all sorts of crises. Chernobyl, the accident at Chernobyl, suddenly nuclear safety was on the radar. And often after this, you get treaties negotiated to deal with the problem. So no one actually is very foresightful, it's always after the event. So then you had 2 nuclear accident conventions come straight after that. Iraq was huge for the agency. So it was asked by the Security Council to inspect Iraq's self-disarmament. So Iraq was obliged to give up all its nuclear capabilities, and the agency was meant to not only verify that, but help destroy the components as well. South Africa suddenly announced that it had the bomb. So the agency was brought in to try and figure out exactly what they'd had and trying to verify South Africa's declarations. North Korea, the agency this time were the ones who discovered North Korea's non-compliance. And that came more or less at the same time as the South African escapade as well. A.Q. Khan, we heard about A.Q. Khan, the Pakistani scientist, spreading nuclear technology around the world. The agency had to get involved then in monitoring trafficking of nuclear materials. And then, of course, we had, moving very quickly down that list, the Iran case, which is currently consuming the agency and has for over a decade now. So I'm not talking specifically about Iran in this presentation, but feel free to ask me questions about that later on. And Fukushima, so another nuclear reactor accident, and the agency had to suddenly leap into action. It actually didn't do it very well, but I'll come to that. So the agency is constantly being confronted with these challenges, these international crises, which really no one was expecting. It was just expecting this scientifically oriented organisation would just potter along and help countries acquire nuclear energy and apply safeguards, and that would be pretty much it. But it's been involved in these crises one after another and has had to learn from that. So the IAEA is now 60 years old, so that's probably a good time to be giving a presentation on it. They now regard themselves as this. This is the way they describe themselves. Independent. Well, that's in the eye of the beholder. The Security Council doesn't necessarily think so, and they're certainly not independent of their member states. So it's quite a quirky self-description, which I ask my students to deconstruct, which they're happy to do. Science and technology-based organisations, certainly that's true, but politics enters the situation quite a lot, particularly in the board of governors. So it's not entirely a science and technology-based organisation. And the global focal point, well, it sort of is and it sort of isn't, as you'll see as I go along. It certainly doesn't run the whole nuclear governance regime as you might expect. But it now has 168 member states. It's run by a 35-member board of governors, of which Australia is more or less a permanent member. There are several founding states of the agency which have managed to get themselves in a situation of being more or less permanent on the board of governors. Either they have uranium or they have quite a significant nuclear enterprise like Canada, a whole series of reactors or other capabilities. Then you have a general conference. So this international organisation is a bit unusual in its the board of governors has really the most authority in running the show. The general conference is often ignored by the board of governors and by the members generally. So that is relatively unusual. The Director General is from Japan, Mr. Yukiya Amano. He's currently running for a third term. Actually the agency has had a series of long-standing Directors General. The Secretariat is only about 2,300 strong, which is surprising, as you'll probably think as I go through exactly what they do. There are currently about 250 inspectors, which has been static for the last several years. It's not a huge expansion of inspectors. Even after Iraq and Iran, it didn't really expand a lot. So they're pretty lean and mean in that respect. The infrastructure is quite impressive. They have this safeguard system which sends inspectors out all over the world. They have equipment everywhere at nuclear power plants and other facilities. They have a series of laboratories at Seibersdorf outside Vienna where they analyse nuclear materials and do experiments on plants and insects and those sorts of things for peaceful uses. They have two regional offices, one in Tokyo and Canada, and one in Toronto for Canada. That's because those two countries, Japan and Canada, have huge numbers of nuclear facilities, and therefore they need safeguarding based on the numbers of facilities they have. The regular budget isn't huge. That's what it is in Australian dollars, depending on the exchange rate with the euro at any one time. Considering what it does and considering how important it is, I think it's a bargain. So let me talk a bit about the various mandates. So after the agency really didn't deliver with this fuel bank idea, various mandates came into play, and they relate to safeguards, which is preventing states acquiring nuclear weapons, safety, which is about stopping accidents like Chernobyl or Fukushima, security, which is about stopping terrorists acquiring nuclear materials or weapons. Then one of their mandates is peaceful uses, so promoting the peaceful uses and assisting states in that. And then technical cooperation, which is really technical assistance, it's development aid for developing countries. And as you can see, mandates for these different areas derive from different sources. So some come from the statute, some come from treaties, and in particular for safeguards, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is vital. So the NPT really, in a way, rescued the IAEA because it made it mandatory for parties to the NPT to submit themselves to inspections, to have safeguards imposed on their system. Before that, it was voluntary. So the NPT is critical to the agency. It really gave its raison d'etre at a certain stage when the agency wasn't looking too healthy. Safety is also in the statute, so preventing accidents, that's clearly there. But the others are controversial, and in particular nuclear security, this idea that the agency should be involved in preventing terrorists acquiring nuclear weapons. That's been contested for many, many years. The Russians still don't like it. The Russians still kick up a fuss now and then, but they let things go through. And that's because states really hold nuclear security very closely. You can imagine, some of them say, we don't want to give a roadmap for terrorists by revealing to the IAEA what we're doing in terms of protecting our nuclear facilities and material. That's only partly true. They could also share a lot of information with the agency and lessons learned. So where these mandates come from really does affect what the agency can do about it. Now, one of the biggest controversies in the agency, and you might be a bit disappointed about this, is actually how much money the developing countries should get for technical cooperation. So there's a whole argument takes place every time the budget comes up at the agency about how much money should go to safeguards, which the Western countries and others regard as essential, preventing states acquiring nuclear weapons, and to nuclear security, preventing terrorists acquiring nuclear weapons. And the developing countries say, well, that's a developed country concern. What we're really interested in is acquiring nuclear technology. So we'll agree to a bigger budget for nuclear safeguards and security if you give us more money for technical cooperation. So, and it's not mentioned in the statute. So the Western powers and others say, well, it's not mentioned in the statute, even though, of course, the whole organisation was designed to promote the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So there's a whole political game going on there. But it does mean that what you see isn't necessarily what you get in terms of the agency's activities. And some of the activities are funded by regular budget and some are funded by voluntary contributions. And you can imagine that creates a lot of pressure on the volunteers, like Australia and others, to provide funding for certain aspects of the agency. So I don't want to bore you with finance. I've done a whole report on finance of the agency, and those reports mentioned a while ago, some related to finance. But you can see here the budgetary priorities of the agency very clearly. So the purple is nuclear verification. That's safeguards. That's inspecting countries to deter them from acquiring nuclear weapons. So it's the bulk of the regular budget. So every year, despite the argument about technical cooperation, verification gets the bulk of the budget. Then you have nuclear safety and security, which is about 10%, not very big. A lot of the budget goes to science, to nuclear development, promotion of peaceful uses. And then we have quite a slice for policy and general management, which you can imagine. It's about a quarter and it's been shrinking. So the agency is actually pretty lean and mean compared to others, like the Food and Agricultural Organisation or others I won't mention. I think it's value for money. So let me talk about three of the mandates now. I'm going to talk about safeguards and the effect of Iraq. I'm going to talk about Fukushima and nuclear safety, and finally nuclear security. So the agency claims that after the Iraq case they learned a lot of lessons and there was actually a revolution in nuclear safeguards. And I pretty much agree with that. I mean, it's not a total revolution, but certainly they have worked very hard to transform what had been a failure So I don't know if you recall, but essentially the Iraqis were building an alternative nuclear infrastructure beyond the berm. You know, these big berms, these big sand barriers. And the Iraqis were building this alternative infrastructure, and the IAEA inspectors would literally walk along the berm and not worry what was on the other side of it. They would even walk past buildings without knowing what was in them and not even ask the Iraqis. So the Iraqis afterward realised this, of course, and they kept building this infrastructure, and they came closer to the bomb than we ever imagined. So the question was then, how do you reform this system? Clearly the inspection system wasn't working properly if it wasn't detecting things that a country hadn't declared. And that's really the nub of it. The agency was focused on checking the declarations states made about what they had, but it wasn't really worried about what was undeclared. And you would think, well, that's really not very logical. But there was general trust that states, because they signed the NPT, because they signed a safeguards agreement, would actually abide by it. No one really imagined that anyone would go to the trouble of violating an agreement once they signed it. So after the Iraq case, Director General Hans Blix and several interested countries, including this one, Australia, got together and decided the agency should strengthen the nuclear safeguard system. And they've done that in several ways. There was something called the 93+2 program, and that designates the year 1993, and they figured, well, it would take 2 years to change the safeguard system. Well, it didn't, so +2 is quite a myth. It's gone on for decades since then. There was a new philosophy adopted, and this is quite interesting, called correctness and completeness. So, as I said, inspectors used to only worry about whether a declaration was complete, not whether it was correct. Oh, sorry, the other way around, whether it was correct and not complete. So now the question is asked, so this declaration states are put forward, is there everything in it that should be in it? If not, questions can be asked. There's something called the state level approach. So the agency used to only worry about nuclear facilities that were declared and not really worry about anything else that was going on in the state. Now they worry about the whole state. They call it a state level approach. So any information that comes to them about anything that's going on in the state is now fair game. Because before states would say, well, that's none of your business. You shouldn't even use journals or scientific articles to investigate what our situation is. Now the agency can do that. And you'll see the list of sources there. They can use open sources, anything on the web, and it's quite amazing what you can find just in states' annual reports on their nuclear activities, for instance, that are publicly available. They use intelligence information from selected states, and certainly in the case of Iraq, Iran, North Korea, they will use intelligence information gained from member states. With caveats, of course, you have to be wary of that. The agency now buys its own satellite imagery, so they actually look down on states. And they've got all sorts of new technology, including remote technology. There's also been a cultural change in the inspectorate, and I've actually done a whole report on this. And there's been an attempt to change the mindset of inspectors. So rather than walking past any building that they haven't had described or listed, they're now encouraged to ask, what goes on in there? Can we have a look? Can you provide documentation that explains what goes on in that building? And if there's a refusal, there has to be a really good reason for the refusal. An inspector can now go back to Vienna and say, okay, we need a complementary access inspection. So we need not just our usual inspection, we need something complementary. And that is a huge change from the past. But you can imagine they had this cadre of inspectors who'd grown up with the agency forever. They were all recruited at pretty much the same time. And to change that mindset is quite difficult. They were very used to a list, checking off a list. Okay, we've checked this amount of material, we've checked this facility, it's got this number of centrifuges in it. What they weren't used to doing was asking questions, being diplomats essentially, pressing the operator of the facility about what actually is going on here. Why is there discrepancies? So this is a social, cultural issue, not a technology issue. And it's very, very difficult. So just a bit more detail about strength and safeguards. So the agency discovered, funnily enough, when it looked at the situation after Iraq, that it actually had lots of powers already, it just wasn't using them. So it got the lawyers on the case, and the lawyers decided, yeah, you can do a lot of things. You can demand advance notification of design information, for instance.
So one of the games the Iranians have been playing for years is saying, oh, no, under the old system we didn't have to notify you of new facilities. And they're the only country who actually declined to go along with this assumption by the agency, this new assumption that you had to provide design information from the minute someone decided they were going to build a new reactor or a new centrifuge plant. In the old days, you didn't have to declare it until material went into it, until nuclear material went into it. And of course, that could be years after the first shovel was used to begin the plant. So this is quite a turnaround. So now states can't just suddenly surprise the agency by saying, oh, voila, we've got a new plant, we're about to introduce new material. No, they have to, from the moment it's a gleam in a minister's eye or a planner's eye, they have to tell the agency. And that was there all along, that the agency decided they actually had that power. They also had the power to do environmental sampling, which is incredibly powerful now. So the agency, when it got some documents from Iran, discovered plutonium particles on the documents. How's that? So the Iranians actually handed over documents and the agency ran them through the Cyberstorm labs and discovered actually particles on them. So this shows you how powerful that technology is. It doesn't solve everything, but it's because then you have to find out, well, where these particles came from, and of course there's always a reason. Oh, well, we imported this, or, yeah, okay. The additional protocol. So this, you've probably heard about this, it's famous. The additional protocol is attached to existing safeguards agreements. So states, when they sign the NPT, are supposed to have a safeguards agreement with the agency. So this is quite extraordinary. They negotiate a bilateral agreement with an international organisation to apply safeguards to their facilities and then allow it to be inspected. It's quite amazing. It's really, I've never heard of it in any other regime. This is quite revolutionary in its day. But what the additional protocol does, and unfortunately it's voluntary, actually allows the agency much more access and much more information than it previously had. So it really does beef up the inspections quite a lot. And as you see there, now 127 states have accepted this additional protocol. Australia was the first, so we're path-breaking in that respect. And after you've had the additional protocol for a few years, you can actually ask for what's called integrated safeguards. So previously the agency just layered additional safeguards requirements, additional inspectors, more reporting, willy-nilly on the top of the state, and of course, after all, it's not very efficient. So once you've had the additional protocol for a few years, the agency can reach what's called the broader conclusion. I know this jargon is a bit much, but broader conclusion is really important. You'll see why in a minute. When you get the broader conclusion that all of your material's been accounted for over X years, ever since you started your nuclear business, then you can get what's called integrated safeguards, which means you get a lesser intensity of safeguard. So they rationalise it. So you don't have to have 5 inspections per year at your reactor. You can have 3 or something like that. You don't need inspectors following transfers of materials. They'll just appear at the beginning and at the end. So these sorts of things to lessen the burden on states. In Australia's case, we don't have much of a nuclear enterprise really, so we were relatively quick in getting this. The Canadians, I think, took about 6 years because Canada's been involved since '45 in the nuclear business. So the agency has to really determine exactly what you've been doing all those years. And you imagine the records have been lost and people's memories fade, and it can be quite difficult. The reason why this is important, this broader conclusion, is because Iran is now required to have one. So the agency will be working, or is already working, to determine the entire scope of Iran's nuclear activities ever since it began its nuclear activities. So that's pretty amazing. So what are some continuing challenges over safeguards? Well, Russia is playing political games, unfortunately, which is surreal because Russia itself doesn't have much in the way of safeguards. It's a nuclear weapons state. It doesn't really have any need to prove that it's not acquiring nuclear weapons. But it's disputing this state-level concept. You imagine the Russians don't like the idea that the agency would be looking at an entire state and everything that's going on within a state, even though the agency doesn't really do that for Russia. So they're playing politics with this, which is very unfortunate, because all through the Cold War, the Russians and or the Soviets and the Americans did pretty well in cooperating to establish the IAEA and its safeguard system. And now they're attempting to undermine that, which is really pretty bad.
There are legal challenges, so the additional protocol is not universal, and of course it's the usual suspects who declined to have one. Iran resisted for a long time, but a number of other states which you think might be suspicious have declined to have one. Even Brazil and Argentina have declined, which is a pity. There's the broader conclusion, which I just talked about. There's been a problem with that, and the agency has applied it inconsistently. So after Fukushima, when Japan couldn't account for all this nuclear material, naturally, that had an accident, it's still got the broader conclusion. The broader conclusion says we know where everything is. We know how much material you have, what location it's in. Obviously, it wasn't Japan's fault, but it would have been a good idea if the agency said, well, we understand it's not your fault, but we can't give you the broader conclusion. Even worse, with Ukraine, because Crimea has now been occupied by the Russians, the agency were initially going to say in their annual report, we're giving the broader conclusion to Ukraine, except for the bit that's now no longer under their control. Unfortunately, the Russians pressurized the agency to take that out. So now it looks like Ukraine's got the broader conclusion, full stop, which is really not good. So they're having problems with this broader conclusion, and hopefully they don't have it with Iran. There's a technological challenge for the agency in detecting undeclared nuclear facilities. You can imagine if a state is bent on hiding facilities, particularly underground, it can be difficult for the agency to detect them. They can do wide area sampling, but it's very expensive, and that would mean roaming around the country with detectors trying to find minute traces of material. So they really need information first, which will direct them to a location before they can do that, even though it's called wide area sampling. And the technology is still incredibly expensive. In terms of human resources, Iran is drawing expertise to its case. Well, not Iran, but the agency is directing its best inspectors, its best analysts to the Iran case, which is fair enough, but it means it's denuding other parts of the safeguards department. And the best people are being drawn away from other cases you might be concerned about. And it takes forever to acquire a nuclear inspector and train them. It's just one of those things. There's also a generational turnover. So now the agency is seeing huge numbers of inspectors leave because they're becoming my age and they're retiring. And so all that collective wisdom, unfortunately, is disappearing. The good thing is, though, that you can then imbibe a new culture into the people who come into the building for the first time. That's one way of changing organisational culture, is to sack everybody and start again. Not that the agency is doing that, but sometimes it's just too hard. People with set minds can't be changed, so you let them go. In this case, they're retiring voluntarily. And then the funding challenge is still there, still linked to this technical cooperation, this argument between the developing countries and the developed about who gets what in the budget. That's all very alarming. So let me talk about Fukushima, which was a wake-up call definitely on nuclear safety. So after Chernobyl, a whole regime was constructed for nuclear safety, which we all thought was actually reasonable. It wasn't perfect, but bits and pieces of it fell apart after Fukushima, partly because of the Japanese, partly because of the agency's own doing. They, really, the Director General Amano did not really seize the issue. You know, the agency describes itself as the focal point of nuclear governance. Well, he just thought, oh, okay, this terrible things happened, in my country, by the way. I mean, he's Japanese. But the agency's role really is to offer assistance, study what happened, and do a lessons learned exercise. What he didn't realise was that the international community looked to the IAEA, the phone was running hot, for information. Governments were looking to the agency, not to Japan. Everyone was worried about the veracity of information coming to Japan. Quite rightly, it's under stress, it's suffering this huge disaster. The agency was supposed to be doing that. The agency had the information, had very good information. They'd studied the possibility of these disasters. They simply weren't communicating it. The spokespersons were terrible. They geared up their incident emergency response center, but they didn't have Japanese speakers. They had to grab Japanese speakers from all over the place. They didn't comment on it for 4 days. Imagine, these huge incidents occurred, which we'd all seen on CNN, and the agency pretended it hadn't happened. The US ambassador virtually ordered Mr. Amano to go to Tokyo and work with the Japanese government on sorting out the public relations disaster. And it was a public relations disaster for the agency. As I said, Japan didn't necessarily do well either. They declined to trigger the mechanism at the agency for providing assistance, and the agency can't really do anything unless the state asks it to, and Japan didn't ask. I guess they were too embarrassed and too busy or too fraught. And so that didn't work. I mean, it's supposed to be pre-prepared assistance that the agency will offer in the case of a disaster, and it sat there. That wasn't good. The IAEA had warned Japan for years that its system was subject to regulatory capture. And that happens when the organisation meant to regulate an industry gets captured by the industry. So there's this constant flow between the regulator and the industry, and eventually the regulators just start to act like they're an arm of the industry. It happens all the time, and you have to really guard against it. And the agency told the Japanese that this was happening. They should have known themselves, but it's good to have an outside body do that. And the Japanese, of course, now have separated their regulator from their promotional aspect, and they're doing the right thing. But it took Fukushima to do that. And the agency were very slow to send assessment teams in. Once they did terrific reports, which many countries are now using to improve safety. So it was a bit of a mixed bag. A reform window opened very quickly, and the whole problem with the safety regime is it's not compulsory. So unlike safeguards, where you're legally bound to accept safeguards to prevent nuclear proliferation, in the safety area and in the security area, it's all voluntary. So you have treaties which just basically say, thou shalt have a safe industry, thou shalt have a secure industry, without really much detail. And all the detail is provided by the IAEA in the form of guidance or recommendations, but it's actually voluntary. So you don't have to comply with it. And much of it's lowest common denominator, because that's all the states can agree on. So there was this window, and France and Russia were leading this push to make safety regulations compulsory worldwide and to have compulsory peer reviews every few years. Unfortunately, Mr. Amano didn't leap into action very quickly. The French held a conference, the UN Secretary General had a conference, and the IAEA were late. And by that stage, US opposition had gathered pace. And so it was actually the United States which closed down that idea, which is a shame. So what are we left with? Voluntary peer reviews. We're still left with voluntary every 3 years. Improved voluntary standards, but they've just lifted the lowest common denominator, and they're still voluntary. So that's a great pity. There is an action plan. It's very slow. There's no systematic reform. It's really a shame. But on the other hand, many states have actually taken heed of what happened at Fukushima and unilaterally improved their safety standards. They've reinforced their reactors. They're providing different emergency teams which can access sites if there is an accident. So all that's good, but it's not coordinated and it's not compulsory, and it's whatever country feels it's able to swallow. A few weeks ago, interestingly, I visited the IAEA Incident and Emergency Response Centre and actually came away very impressed. So they hired someone from Lufthansa's safety division, and he has knocked that place into order like you wouldn't believe. So they actually have an actual centre now. Before it was just this mythical thing. They have someone on call 24 hours to look around the world for nuclear accidents and receive the incoming data. They have teams which will be called in as soon as a notification comes in. But the most interesting part was, and this is a lesson of Fukushima, they have a glass wall, and so all the security experts are inside this room with a glass wall. On the other side, the Director General is allowed to come and other agency officials, but they're not allowed actually into the Incident and Emergency Centre, because one of the lessons of Fukushima was that politicians and leaders, including the Japanese Prime Minister, were interfering in the rescue operation, the safety business. So I thought that was pretty good. Yeah, they also gave me a badge. Yeah, so that's a good example of the agency learning from industry. They've actually decided to get someone in from industry in the safety realm. The main thing the agency learned, though, is about public communication. They have to communicate because people expect them to. They can't call themselves the focus of global nuclear governance and then shrink when something happens, which is exactly what they did. So quite a few lessons learned there. Let me talk briefly about nuclear security. So this is a rather odd one because there'd been a long struggle within the agency about whether nuclear security was even part of their mandate. So the Russians and others argued, no, this is purely national. How can the agency be involved in security in any way within our country, even though they had safeguards inspectors looking at safeguarded material and facilities? Security was regarded as just too sensitive. Then 9/11 happened, and even though it wasn't nuclear, there was a lot of talk at the time that this actually could have been nuclear, could have involved some sort of radioactive material. So funnily enough, that gave an impetus to the IAEA and member states to strengthen the agency's role in nuclear security. But again, it's voluntary. So the agency now has voluntary guidelines for states to improve their nuclear security. You need guards, gates, and guns around your nuclear reactor. Interestingly, the agency's Cyberdorf laboratories, when I went there the first time, had no security. You could just walk in. It was sitting in a field. A few weeks ago when I went, boy, it's like Fort Knox. So even the agency itself has got the message that actually nuclear security is important. The agency organises peer reviews. It doesn't actually do them, but it organises experts who will go to a country and have a look at what their security arrangements are, within limits, of course, because of the sensitivity. It runs this illicit trafficking database, so companies and countries can provide information to the agency, and it now sets up this network. You can do all sorts of fancy things with computer programs, I gather, and you can track those who are trying to sell things against those who are trying to buy them. And mostly the information they get is about failed requests. So a country or a company will get a request and they look very suspicious. But as we know, what happens is that people shop around. So if they've been rejected in one country, they're likely to go to another, which gives you actually a pretty good sense of who's trying to buy what and where they might try next. So that's quite useful. But all these activities are voluntary. There's something called the Nuclear Security Fund. It's not in the regular budget. So this, again, it's this developing country, country dilemma. And one of my proposals in my report is that there should be this grand bargain. So, okay, everything goes into the regular budget. The regular budget is funded by every member state according to how wealthy they are, essentially, according to their GDP. So you pay a percentage to the agency budget, which seems to be the fairest of all. Otherwise, this voluntary funding comes from, by and large, the United States, the Scandinavians, the European Union, Australia, of course, Canada. But every time there is a voluntary fund, guess who puts into it? It's these countries. And you have free riders, like China. So in my financial study, I reveal that actually China is the biggest free rider of all. China does not provide much in the way of voluntary funding to the IAEA. And yet, they've got one of the biggest nuclear programs, setting up huge numbers of nuclear reactors and benefiting from the IAEA's guidance and other assistance. In this field, nuclear security too, there's a whole lot of other bodies involved. So it's a real mishmash and it's a coordination problem. So you have bodies set up by the United States and Russia, the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism. You have a Russian-sponsored international convention to suppress acts of nuclear terrorism. You have the UN Security Council weighing in with a resolution that says every state has to report to the Council on what it's doing to prevent nuclear terrorism and chemical terrorism and biological terrorism. So coordinating all this is a nightmare, and actually the agency hasn't been given that role. You can only bring groups together and hope that somehow they're going to be able to coordinate things. Now, as you know, so the orphan isn't Mr. Nazarbayev from Kazakhstan, but that was just the best shot of the podium. So as you know, did a whole series of nuclear summits organised by the Obama administration. There were 4. They were pretty effective. They were a club. Essentially, Washington decided who to invite, so other IAEA member states were pretty annoyed at that. They were very successful in they did encourage states to do more in the nuclear security area, like give up their highly enriched uranium, ship it to Russia or the US, to put greater security around their nuclear facilities, to talk about watering down highly enriched uranium, blending it with natural uranium to remove that danger altogether. So in nuclear security, we're talking about materials often. It's bomb materials, highly enriched uranium and plutonium. And there's a lot of progress from the summit. But again, it was all voluntary. Well, it was the United States egging countries on and pushing them and possibly doing a quid pro quo here and there to enable this. Now the summits are finished. Obama's obviously finishing his term. There's no sign that Hillary Clinton, much less Donald Trump, will take this further. So essentially the summits have gone, they've set up a contact group with only a select group of the select group, which is probably not a good idea. So the question is, who now pushes for nuclear security? And there's a lot riding on the IAEA because they're, in a sense, the biggest game in town. Most countries are members of the agency. They have something called the Nuclear Security Conference. The next one is in December. So all eyes are on the agency to see whether it can do this. And this is problematic. You know, the US administration, a president has enormous leverage. You can ring up and say to Mr. Nazarbayev, get on a plane and come to my conference, or else we won't be collaborating on all sorts of other things. The agency can't do that. The agency can't boss countries around. So it'll be interesting to see whether the agency can take up the mantle of the nuclear security summits. I think not, but we're keeping our fingers crossed on that. Luckily, since the summit ended, the last one, the amendment to what's called the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, I know it's a huge mouthful, the CPNMM, has entered into force. And this amendment's been hanging around since 2006. And what it does, it extends compulsory nuclear security provisions to states domestically. So the original convention only applied to transport of nuclear materials between countries, saying you should make that as secure as you possibly can on ships or rail or whatever. Now, because of the amendment, it applies to domestically your entire country. So now you have to apply nuclear security to all the bits and pieces that make up your nuclear activity. So that's quite a development. And the agency is in charge of organising the process to get that going. So that's quite a hopeful sign. So the future of the agency, Iran, I mentioned briefly. It's quite a momentous thing for the agency because the agency will have to, at some stage, as I said, give Iran the broader conclusion or not. So the way it works is the agency will work with the Iranians for as long as it takes to get the broader conclusion. And as I said, for Canada it took 6 years. You imagine Iran's been in this business for decades. They've got to account for every single bit of nuclear material they ever had, explain what happened to it, did it go into waste, what purpose was it used for, how much is left, what are their current activities all over Iran. So those who are worried that the so-called JCPOA agreement didn't catch everything can be reassured because now the broader conclusion will capture everything. The danger is, of course, that the agency simply won't be able to reach the broader conclusion, either because the Iranians aren't cooperating or because the documents are gone, the officials won't talk to them. So you can see this crisis coming up, you know, with this Iranian agreement if this doesn't pan out well. And you can imagine the pressure on the IAEA from the Russians, from the Iranians, to get this right in Iran's favour. And from the other side, to make sure the agency doesn't shortchange us in terms of the broader conclusion. So this is one of these unbelievably delicate issues for the agency. I don't know when this will happen. Some people are saying 10 years, 12 years. The Iranians have been saying just a few years. A few years will be done. We'll see, probably not. Leadership is another big issue. Mr. Amano is standing for a third term, even though he said he wouldn't when he was first appointed. So that's rather disappointing. He has only one rival, an Argentinian gentleman who probably doesn't have support. Australia's already thrown its hat in the ring, unfortunately, I think. So there'll be a tussle about the leadership later on in the year, but I think Mr. Amano will get back in. That's a mixed blessing. He's been quite good on Iran, but he faltered on Fukushima, and he's made the agency much less transparent than it used to be. Doesn't cooperate well with the likes of me, NGOs or academics. Not good with industry. It's problematic. Oh, and I should have mentioned too, he's changed the slogan of the agency. It used to be Atoms for Peace. Now it's Atoms for Peace and Development, as a way of cultivating favour with the developing countries so he can get re-elected, to put it bluntly. So that's a problematic. He just announced to the board, I've changed the slogan of the agency. And it's not a development agency. It does that development stuff really badly. It's the Cinderella Department of the IAE, and yet now it takes up half of its name. So that's rather disturbing. Making nuclear safety and security legally binding is a big tussle and something that's essential, but unfortunately it may take another disaster for that to happen. Because it almost happened with Fukushima. God forbid we have a nuclear detonation somewhere or some radiological incident which would then steel people's nerve to actually make all this compulsory. But that, unfortunately, is probably what it will take. The agency reacted very well usually to crises, so that might be what's required. And then finally, the agency, I didn't mention resources and technology. The agency does all right with resources. I mean, its budget has been held to zero real growth, but occasionally it gets a bump. It could do more with more, and it does require the latest technologies. Some states are providing that, but it still hasn't got enough. But then finally, the future of nuclear energy is itself uncertain. So Japan is probably not going to have the same fleet of reactors it's had. Germany's getting out of it. Sweden and Belgium are wavering. Other countries are saying no, they're not actually going to go there. Whereas in our part of the world, several countries are boosting their capacity. China, India, Vietnam is going to acquire, Bangladesh, of all countries. So you're going to have a divided membership. You're going to have countries which continue to be enthusiastic about nuclear energy and others who say, no, we're not. And this is something that's plagued the European Union in dealing internally with its nuclear enterprises. There's a whole group of European countries which are anti-nuclear and others which are quite pro. And this might have a tendency to divide the agency on even more lines than it already is. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.